because you get all the joy and then you can send them home.
Yep.
Yeah, you don't have to do the disciplining. Yeah.
Fill them full of sweets and send them home.
Sugar them up on the way out just sugar them up on the way out the door and send them back to their mom and dad. That's good.
Spoil them rotten.
Are we ready to go?
You're ready now? Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, well then with that, I will start our Fillmore Piru Groundwater Sustainable Meeting. Thank you all for joining. And if I could have Gordon Kimball lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I have a flag on the screen. Ready?
Pledge allegiance
To
to
the
the flag
flag of the
United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. And with that, Eva, if you could roll call, please.
Okay. For myself, Director Kimball,
here.
Chair Long,
Here.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Here.
Director Minigan,
Here.
Director Pace.
Here.
Thank you.
Wow, Eva, your internet is really going in and out. It's like your space in the background of yours.
True.
Yeah, you're on Mars or something. Okay, so we have everyone here except for a representative from the city of Fillmore who will be appointed by their board probably this month or next month, and then they'll join us as soon as we can. So with that, I'll ask if there's any public comments. Do I have any public comments? Anyone raise their hand? If not, if you could just speak up because I can't see everybody. Okay, so with that, there are no public speakers. I will move to the approval of the agenda. Is there any modifications to this agenda? If not, can I get a motion and a second?
So moved.
Okay, it's motion by Director McFadden,
I'll second.
second by Director Minigan, and roll call, Eva.
Okay. Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace.
Yes.
All right, so that motion is approved unanimously. Thank you very much. Next up is our director's announcements. So first off, Fillmore Pumpers Association.
So we had a regular board meeting December 8th. We discussed our putting forward a straw man on the SMC for subsidence, and understand that Brian Bondi and Tony Morgan have coordinated that, discussed that, and that it's in the works. And I think generally the stakeholder feedback we got was that they were pleased with the board's listening and the consultants listening to comments, and felt like they were really being listened to and responded to. So in terms of stakeholder communication, that feedback was very positive. I think that's pretty much it.
Okay. And then we have the Piru pumpers.
I would just echo what Gordon mentioned. I think we're getting quite a bit of participation at the workshops, the meetings from pumpers, and we've continue to encourage them to participate in each of the workshops or whatever there is, just because even if it doesn't sound like a topic, perhaps that may be overly exciting for them or as relevant, perhaps, we're trying to encourage everyone to continue to participate and know what's going on and be well informed as we make decisions and moving forward. So I think that's all we have for Piru tonight.
Okay, thank you. And then we have environmental.
Yeah, so a few of our environmental stakeholders met on December 9th. And this was really in relation to some of the comments that were provided by TNC at the SMC workshop that I wasn't in attendance of. I followed up with them with regards to some of the dieback they saw with regards to groundwater dependent ecosystems. We had a presentation by Christopher Keebler, who's doing remote sensing work with regards to ground cover sensitivity with depleted groundwater levels. And I've requested that we have Mr. Keebler present at our January 2021 meeting, because I thought it was timely and worthwhile information to be aware of as a board, and how that can provide guidance for SMCs and minimum thresholds for groundwater dependent ecosystems moving forward. We also had a discussion as a group about outlining some of our concerns and not only concerns, but what we'd like to see be considered in the SMC development with regards to GDEs. And we're aiming to have that to the full board as an environmental stakeholder group by early January.
Okay, thank you. There's no report from City of Fillmore. And Candace, can you make sure that you remind us on the item for future agenda items? I want to make sure that that's captured there as well.
Yeah.
Even though we said we're going to do it, just make sure it's captured. And then we have United Water.
Nothing new for tonight. I'll pass to the next.
Okay. Then we have the County of Ventura. We got our first vaccines yesterday. That was exciting. COVID-19 is the big thing. As far as county goes, we had our last board meeting in regards to farming. The industrial hemp ordinance did get passed, and it's a 1/4 mile from sensitive sites with Tierra Bajada area excluded. And then there's some other items in regards to smell and compliance with harvesting, and then also with public safety and so forth. So that is going to be out for everyone to know. But the reason why I brought that up was in case there's any of that farming in the Santa Clara region. That might be helpful for farmers when there's no water or in the summer times or certain things like that. So wanted to make sure you're aware of that. And then also we will be, our board commissions come back up on January. I don't see myself being moved off the Fillmore Piru GSA, but I just wanted to let you know. So that happens, like there's Fox Canyon GSA that's has a board member that is no longer there. So there'll be good information coming up in the next month. So I think that's really it. There's a lot of other stuff, but it's not that important. So with that, I'll give you the executive director update.
Good evening, afternoon. I guess it's really afternoon, but it's dark outside, so maybe it's evening. I have a few things to provide updates on. Our receivables as of December 11th is slightly lower than last month, so we're headed in the right direction. We have approximately 42,500 and some change of open invoices regarding groundwater, which we're working to try to get that down. DWR grant open invoices are 162,000. And a portion of that is the 10% retention from prior invoices to DWR. So I think the last 2 invoices, one that's in the 90,000 range and one that's in approximately 50,000, are still outstanding, and we should expect to receive reimbursement from the state on those in the near future. We've almost finished our 7th period in the grant. It's hard to imagine that 7 quarters have gone by, but we're starting work on progress report number 7, and there'll be an invoice along with that, and that will be submitted in about 6 or 7 weeks or sooner. A little update on the groundwater model. So as we heard in the workshop, validation's complete and in good shape. Documentation is in process. When I checked with the team a little bit earlier, they've put a bit of the documentation effort on pause while they're trying to finish their first forward-looking model run. So they just recently completed the first forward-looking model run for the Mound Basin GSA, and reviewing the results, and they're going to circle right back to getting the documentation done. But that the new target for that is January 2021. So we're still a little ways off from that, but I don't think there's anything glaring that would cause us to not want to use this model for our work. So so we look forward to that documentation being completed, but I'm glad that the model's already in use. We've continued coordination with Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency. Those have been good. I did not attend the last meeting, but Dan Detmer did. And one thing I believe I shared with you, and I wasn't quite sure because they were preliminary results, is that their plan is assuming that output to the Santa Clara River watershed from the Valencia and Saugus plants is going to remain fairly steady throughout the planning period. So the next 20 years, and then as far as they know, the next 50 years. There may be some recycling that goes on, but that would probably be the Newhall Ranch project that will be doing recycling as it can. Maybe can recycle all its water, its wastewater in the summertime, and probably do a discharge to the river in the winter. And then there are some developments that we understand there are some developments that are further along the I-14 corridor on the very east end of the Santa Clarita Basin that may be doing some recycling up there. But it's a good thing for us on the water balance on the downstream basin to hear confirmation from that group that that there isn't going to be there isn't anticipated at this time in their planning documents any major change in the output that goes from the Santa Clarita Basin or the East Basin to the Piru. So that has been confirmed by that group, and those factors will be included in our forward-looking model as an assumption. And I did say that I have some information on the Santa Clarita Valley Sanitation District chloride reduction project. The regional board recently took an action on that. I haven't had a chance to review all that, and I will circle back with you with a project report on that one. We do also have on the list for future consideration as the Newhall Ranch project update. And then as you directed, staff will be working with legal counsel to continue to try to build a receivables and collection system that is effective, but not very costly. So we're continuing to work on that. And then I can add to the bottom of the list is we've asked Stillwater and the DBSNA team to reach out to Christopher Keebler on his observations in the study that he has. And I think your board will find that interesting. He's some of my coworkers at United saw that presentation a week or so ago. And so we're going to do our best to arrange for him to participate in the January meeting. I think it's appropriate because we're right in the middle of talking about groundwater dependent ecosystems and riverine habitat. So we'll arrange that. And that's all I have tonight.
All right, thank you so much. And then next up, we have it from our legal counsel. Hi, Steve. How are you doing?
Very well. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see everybody again.
Just, I think a short legal report on a couple of items. Number one, I think the follow-up on the collection on anticipated or perhaps expected delinquencies. We continued the dialogue with the county council, and we got a response from them that I'd like to push back on, frankly, because they're looking at the ability of us to employ a statute to employ, sorry, my notebook just fell, to employ a lien or of an item on the property tax roll for delinquencies. The county does have that, and I think this is old news, but the county does have that in its county ordinances for nuisance abatement. And in our view, it's very consistent with what Sigma talks about, in the sense that for collections and for penalties, there is a due process component of that process where we have to give the potential payor notice. There's a bit of an administrative hearing process where they get a chance to be heard, and then there's a decision made. That exists in both Sigma and in the county ordinance, with the one difference being that with the county on a nuisance abatement situation, the county can put it on the tax rolls. And as you may recall, the structure we're dealing with here is that Sigma allows us to sue to enforce, to file a civil suit to enforce these penalties, or to employ the same remedies that are available to the kind of the lead agency in the JPA, which in this case is the County of Ventura. So we've been a little, I guess, frustrated. There was some changeover in personnel at County Council. Someone had retired who was a little late getting back to us, but we did get word at the end of November that they didn't find any statutory authority for this, but I'd like authority to kind of keep pushing with them, because I think the remedy does not exist in the statute, but in their own county ordinances that discuss this. So I talked to Tony about this earlier, about I think it would behoove us to keep pushing on this, because I know the board's interested in having that option available if we encounter delinquencies on any of the fees that are due.
Well, this is information only, so we can't really discuss it, right?
Yeah, you have given us marching orders in the past on the same issue.
Yes.
And so I'm informing you that we're continuing to push on this, and have been a little frustrated, frankly.
Yes, and I can understand. So it was Leroy Smith that retired, and Michael Walker is a new county council. And I'm not sure if you're talking with Jeff Barnes, but if you'd like to talk in a separate meeting out of this, I would be more than happy to try to get some assistance with you.
Yeah, we had the good experience of using your name at the county, Director Long, and your chief of staff was very helpful. We appreciate that.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And just two other items I wanted to bring to the board's attention. As we've discussed in the past, you know, with regards to CEQA, we know that it's not applicable to the plan preparation and adoption. There's statutorily that's the case, but my partner Keith Lemieux represents another GSA up in the Indian Wells Valley who is a bit ahead of us. They've adopted their plan, and now they're setting fees, and a legal issue has arose in that sense, in that context rather, where they are poised to adopt these fees, and they've been sued on a CEQA lawsuit saying that the imposition of the fees constitutes a project for purposes of CEQA. Again, we're in this area where we have a new statute with a lot of implications, and it's just starting to hit the courts because, of course, the fees are part and parcel in a way of the adoption of the GSP, which is exempt from CEQA. So there's a legal issue that's being litigated up there now that I'm going to make sure we keep an eye on, because it may be something we can all learn from as we move forward. Lastly, when Tony and I spoke today, I noticed we had a discussion that I noticed on the agenda, the waiver issue. I'd like to consider, and I'll continue the dialogue with Tony about bringing an $11 waiver to the board's attention, it may be more efficient to try to establish some criteria and maybe perhaps create some discretion in the executive officer position to work through these types of waivers and exemptions.
Great, thank you.
And that
Okay.
concludes my attorney report.
Thank you. Now on to our GSP consultants.
How's everyone doing tonight?
Good.
Good.
Well, you have a pretty festive background, Tony.
Hey, that's what we're doing right now.
Gave up on the drilling rig.
Yeah, we went for something different. I'm easily amused, so I changed my background, Okay, you should be able to see a screen popped up there now. We've got a few agenda items. Mostly tonight, we're going to spend a significant amount of time maybe on item 4G. It's a continuation of discussion of sustainable management criteria. And then we also have Lisa Ballin with us tonight, and I'm going to ask her if she would give us a recap of the most recent workshop. Lisa, please.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. So we had our third stakeholder workshop on December 9th, and it went really well. It was obviously on the groundwater model, and we had about 35 people in total, 21 of whom were members of the public and stakeholders. We received some great presentations, so big thank you to Dan Detmer and Dr. Jason Sun. We had presentations on how the groundwater model was developed, how it was reviewed by experts, its accuracy and its reliability. We talked about its uses and its limitations, as well as some of the key input parameters that are in the model and that are anticipated to be used for forward forecasting. We also had presentations on historical and current water budgets. And I think the presentations were really well received and appreciated. We didn't get a lot of comments, just a few questions. The most substantive one had to do with assumptions for future conditions modeling and whether that would be based on the past or if we would be accounting for the potential for more severe droughts or longer droughts that have been experienced historically. So that we had some discussion about that. But other than that, I think it went really well, and we've kind of buttoned up this model topic in terms of the stakeholder input, and we'll be continuing our subsequent stakeholder workshops on sustainable management criteria continuation and going down the line on projects management actions, and then the last ones will be on the actual draft GSP. So that's all I have on
Thanks,
that.
Lisa.
If anybody has any questions. Thanks.
Okay, anyone questions? None? All right, then we'll move to,
So we're going to
go ahead.
say, well, let's just take a quick look at the schedule, please, if we have a moment. So we're at this point today in December. I have a draft of the tech memo for subsidence on my desk for review before I release it. The documentation for the model you've heard is in play. It's being worked on. Stillwater is actively working on their GDE stuff. I've got a little bit of information that I'll input into the item 4G that we'll talk about tonight. We had a tentative idea of having a workshop for the SMCs here, and so we need to talk about that, I think, but I believe we have an agenda item later this evening to talk about whether and when we might need the next stakeholder workshop. So we'll hold off on that discussion until item 4F, it looks like, on the agenda. So we got some discussion about future conditions workshop as well. So we'll have a little bit of dialogue later on about these and their timing as they relate to all the other tech memos and things that are in play. So one of the other big items is the monitoring well project. I just wanted to give you a quick update on that. We've got 3 engineering level cost estimates received from 3 different firms. as despite our best efforts to get them to standardize their responses to us, we got apples, oranges, and kiwi fruits from the three contractors. And so we're trying to standardize their bids a bit so we can do a comparison of them and make a sense of what they're asking for in the way of funding. Again, these are just the engineering level bids. We'll sharpen our pencils on what we actually want them to do and put out a formal RFP in the not too distant future. But right now we're just trying to get these standardized so that we can decide on whether we're looking for 5 sites to drill wells or 8 sites to drill wells, however far the money will go. And so that's the reason for wanting to standardize them. We're also adding in the other, I'll call them non-drilling costs that we need to make sure we account for in the grant. So that's the project pre-planning efforts, all of the easements, make some sort of estimate, and I'll work with the executive director to figure out how we want to structure that, make sure we've got money in there for laboratory analysis for initial water quality, some field personnel for construction oversight, a bit of a contingency there is always a good idea on a drilling project. So we're working all that up, and again, hopefully it'll come to you in the January meeting with more details on that. So that's it for this quick update. Questions?
Tony, just with regards to the 5 versus 8, that still is for 5 individual, because I recall that we moved away from 2 nested wells, and it's a nested well and then others. So is that, we still splitting it?
Yeah, then a series of shallow wells, and the idea was we'll take a look at the bids that we get and then decide, can we afford 1 nested well and 5 additional shallow piezometers, or is it 8 additional piezometers? What can we afford? That gives us an idea from the engineering cost estimate that if we have to go out and start looking for land and negotiating easements and that kind of thing, then we can begin to go get that process started, because that will take a little bit of time. But in the meantime, we can prepare the formal RFP for the drilling firms to bid to and say, this is exactly what we want you to do. This is our best guesstimate of how deep we want you to go. And here are the site conditions we expect to anticipate at the various locations.
So you're still going to bring back what that is, what the RFP is, to the full board for approval?
Of course. Yes, and I would recommend that the RFP go through legal counsel as well, because there will be terms and conditions associated with that the drilling folks will have to, or should be asked to comply with. But I think legal counsel should put their eyes on those documents as well.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, that's it for me for this item.
I'm not sure if we lost Chair.
All right.
Sorry, I'm here. I'm multitasking. I apologize. I was listening. Something just came in and it's really sad. Okay, so next is our consent calendar. If we could review that, if there's any questions. If not, a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve the consent calendar as presented.
Thank you, Director McFadden, for the motion. And a second.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Director Pace. And roll call, please, Eva.
Okay. Director Kimball? Chair Long?
Yes.
Vice Chair McFadden?
Aye.
Director Minigan?
Yes.
Director Pace?
Yes.
All right, motion is approved unanimously. Thank you very much. The next item is our waiver for late fees and interest for Blake Leslie and accounts. And this is what our council was talking about in regards to maybe providing executive order for anything at a certain price. So if you'd like to walk us through that, Tony.
I will. Chair Long and board, this particular customer has multiple accounts, and has a significant credit balance on one of them, approximately $1,500, and assumed that that the agency billing would catch that and apply the credit balance to all of the accounts, which we did not do, and we were not asked. And so the one account that had a credit balance ended up with a smaller credit balance, and the other ended up incurring late fees and interest. Subsequently, the customer contacted us. It was worked out. Credit was applied, but Leslie Blake has asked for the agency to waive the late fees and interest on this one for a total of $67.20.
All right, any questions, directors?
Chair
Go
Long,
ahead.
I have a suggestion.
Mhm.
If we may be required to go through all these individually, but I would suggest that maybe we, unless there's questions about 4A, 4B, 4C, 4D, that we lump them together as a single motion item.
Let me ask our council.
That would be appropriate, but just let's make sure we have a roll call on that. If it's one motion for the remainder of the items, it's like any other item. I just want to make sure we get a roll call.
Okay, so this will be a motion to approve as recommended for motion items 4A, 4B, 4C, and 4D.
And I'll make that motion, but I'll just also add, after reading through them, I think there are good reasons for all four to waive the late fee. So I will make the motion that we waive the late fees in all four items, 4A, 4B, and 4C, and 4D.
Thank you. So that's motioned by Director McFadden. Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, by Director Minigan. And Eva, roll call, please.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Right.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
All right, motion is approved, unanimous. Thank you. Next is our ad hoc committee for workloads and director's assignments.
Chair Long,
Yes.
this was a result of Director Minigan giving notice to your board at the last meeting that she was going to need to reduce some of her workload, and expressed at the time that she intends to participate in the board meetings. However, wasn't sure if she would be able to continue participation in the other committees. Just to cut to the bottom line, my feeling is that the SMC ad hoc committee has done its job, and that whatever work we are going to be doing on SMC development and finalization is in the full board and the stakeholders' hands at this point. And so I would recommend that the board thank the SMC ad hoc committee and set them free from future duties on that. And I feel that that there probably is some utility for the stakeholder outreach committee, but clearly the workload is much smaller than it has been. And often Lisa Boline sends out an email to the committee and says, we have a draft agenda for the next workshop coming up, and would you like to meet? Are there any comments? And the last time there weren't any comments, and the committee decided not to meet. So perhaps we could find a replacement for Director Minigan, or I don't know if there's any reason an ad hoc committee can't stay at 2 members while she's gone. So it seems you have some choices, but it doesn't look like the anticipated workload of either of these ad hoc committees is going to be really large going forward.
Stephanie, I'll make a
Are
comment.
there any thoughts? Yes.
One comment I'll make is that committee is an easy committee thanks to Lisa. Just all the work she does. So I would have no problem just leaving it with 2 people, unless somebody's dying to get on the committee.
Yeah, I think it was more that with regards to the outreach engagement ad hoc, that they had been interest indicated by the previous Fillmore, City of Fillmore representative. And, you know, I know that the workload has become somewhat less, but it was more providing an opportunity if the City of Fillmore did want to fill those shoes while I was gone, that they could, or take over that ad hoc committee. That, you know, the circumstances have afforded the opportunity if the City of Fillmore is interested, or not, or an alternative board member for that matter.
Gordon, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me it'd be a great introduction for the new representative from the city of Fillmore, and that representative does represent a significant group of stakeholders as well. But given that the city of Fillmore's members most all have full-time jobs, we probably need to wait until that person is appointed and can say whether they're able to do it or not. But
Yeah, I would just suggest leaving it as is. And when the City of Fillmore representative comes and Tony's training them, giving them a little insight before our first meeting, we can offer that up. And then if they have any interest in it, then we can bring this back in a different agenda item. That'd be my suggestion, unless one of the board members here right now would like to fill Candace's spot on that. All right. So with that, there no motion needs to be made if you're okay with that.
Okay with that.
Okay. Moving on.
Moving on.
Next item. But you know what? I do have to say, Candace, thank you so much for even thinking about that and making sure that we're covered. I really do appreciate it.
No, you're welcome.
The next one is consider the date for the next stakeholder workshop. Lisa.
Yes. So as Tony Morgan mentioned earlier, we've been having some in previous discussions, we've been talking about the possible need for an additional stakeholder workshop on sustainable management criteria. And we had previously mentioned January as a possible timeframe for that. However, our current thinking is that it would be best to hold that meeting, if we do want to have it, after the future model runs are completed, and those are currently anticipated to be completed at the end of this month, if I've got that right. So we're suggesting to consider the potential for additional meeting to be held in February rather than January, and we would bring this back up at the January board meeting to discuss that.
Okay. Any comments, anyone?
Sounds good.
Sounds good to me too.
Yeah, by that time, we will have more information, I think, from the environmental supporters with some of their input, and some of also the Pumpers Association. So hopefully with that data, it'll help inform those discussions.
Okay. So we don't need a motion for this either, because it's just gonna be moved to the next agenda item. We won't do that with the next one. Okay, thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate you always making sure we're on our toes and engaging our stakeholders as soon as we can. And appreciate that they're also here at the meeting today. So the next item is our sustainable management criteria, and I think this will take the remaining amount of our meeting. So I will pass that on. Tony.
All right, I think Patrick's going to kick us off and get us going on here. So I'll let Patrick share his screen, and we'll get underway.
Right.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So we will start off with just a little follow-up on the stress test that we presented last meeting. And then Tony will talk about how we're going to approach the surface water depletions. Okay, so you may remember this table from last meeting. What we did was we took the baseline pumping volumes, the average volume per year that would be extracted in each basin, which we'd call the baseline conditions, based on the model from 1985 to present. Fillmore typically pumps about 47,000 acre feet per year, while Piru pumps a little over 11,000 acre feet per year. So we ran the model once through that, which United has done and calibrated to. And then we asked them to go back and increase pumping basin-wide by 20%, 40%, so on, up to a hypothetical, what if we doubled pumping in each basin? So when we look at the results, I'm just going to show you a few more examples throughout the basin. This time focusing on what water level responses would look like in regards to how long it takes for the water levels to recover. So just to rehash what we're looking at here is we're looking at a domestic well at the western end of Fillmore, a shallow well, and down here is a hydrograph showing measured water levels with the blue dots. The black line, which is kind of covered up, is the baseline conditions, closely matching the measured water levels that actually occurred in history. And then what you see in each color below that are the different model scenarios. So if we had pumping increased by 20% overall, that would be the first yellow line below the black line. It closely mimics those water levels. And as you would expect, if you keep pumping more, your water levels would decline further. And last time we summarized how much water levels you would expect them to be shifted downward during the droughts, such as the late 80s and the more recent drought. As it makes sense, during the droughts, you have more drastic water level declines. But what we're impressed to see is that according to the model, even if we were to double the pumping, there's during normal conditions, during the wet years, the basin water levels essentially recover to the baseline conditions. So what I would just like to convey in these few slides is we're also going to look at when we do the future model run, depending on how climate change impacts the water budget and also any changes in pumping and things like that. How long would we need water levels to recover back to baseline conditions, depending on if we increase pumping or something like that? So what we're just looking at here is between the scenarios of adding 20%, even 100% more pumping, it'd be between a range of maybe really, it wouldn't take any longer for water levels to recover, or it could take up to about 4 years at this location under the kind of hypothetical doubling of pumping. So this is kind of the range of extra recovery time we would have to consider. And this is just a demonstration of the approach that we are proposing to do when we run the future model. So here's one location in the West Fillmore Basin. I'll show you another one of the basin boundaries between the Fillmore and Piru basins. This is an area of the rising groundwater, which Tony will show us some more about in the second part of this presentation. And here what you can see is, according to the model, even if we doubled pumping, the recovery time would take about 2 more years to get back to baseline conditions under that kind of climate. But if we only increase pumping by about 20%, there's really no difference in the recovery time. So it's essentially zero extra years. Show you one more example. This is in the eastern end of Piru. You can see the water levels, even if you double pumping, or closely mimic baseline conditions. by eyeballing, it looks like it would take maybe 2 extra years to get back to baseline conditions in this part of Piru. So in summary, what we noticed is if we even had a 20% increase in pumping, there really wouldn't be any extra recovery time needed, which is important when we think about climate change in the future. How often will droughts occur, for how long, and things like that. And as we can tell, the model will give us useful information that if things got very drastic, if we had either much less precipitation or much more pumping, we'd have to consider how long we need the basin to be able to recover to get back to sustainable levels. And lastly, I'll just show one table here. This is a little more detailed table than what I showed last meeting. What we're looking at here are each type of well in each basin. And according to the model, what number of wells would go dry at any point in time based on what pumping scenario we're in. So according to the model, currently, essentially no well has gone dry during the droughts especially. But as we evaluate the model at higher and higher pumping levels, you kind of get an idea of how many more wells would go dry. So at 20% more pumping, it's on the wells that we have well construction information for, only one ag well in Fillmore would go dry at some point. Of course, the water levels would recover and we could continue to operate once the drought is over. But and as intuitively, you would expect more and more wells to go dry over time if you're to keep increasing pumping overall. I just wanted everyone to see the kind of impacts we could expect. Yes.
Can I ask a question? So if you're saying it's 2 ag wells, is that a 1 farm, 2 farms, or is it 1 well in 10 wells of a farm? What do we know about that?
Right. So you're talking about like the spatial distribution. Like, are these 2 wells on the same property or?
Yeah.
Yeah. That would have been a good thing for me to show you. But this is just individual wells. We'll definitely, when we do the full, the thorough evaluation, especially with the feature model, depending on what projects and projected changes we expect, we would show you maps of where these wells are.
And then the other thing is that below bottom of screen, and that just depends on whoever's well, how deep they put their well and what screen is at their height. So we're not managing that.
That's an interesting question. I would refer that question to Tony Morgan. But
say that again, Director.
I'm just saying that if I knew that my well would get dry at 40% below the baseline, can I drill the well deeper so I'll get more water? Which means the screen is deeper, right? Or maybe I'm misunderstanding.
You could drill a deeper well if you wanted to do that.
Okay.
If you think your well is going to go dry. If we're in a situation where our pumping is expected to be baseline plus 40, and you're one of these 2 wells, for example, in there, you have that option of drilling a new well, or waiting till water levels recover.
Okay, thank you.
But just to clarify, Kelly, it does, you really can't drill the existing well deeper. It means the only real practical way is drilling a replacement well.
Okay, and so when you're saying levels below the screen, below the bottom of the screen, what does that mean for layman?
It's dry.
It's just dry. Okay, thank you. There was a question of that in the chat, and so I wanted to ask.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Yes. So like when the water level goes below the bottom of the screen, essentially no water can come in anymore. So.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have like an average on when you add 20%, like what the drop in well level is in feet?
Right. So last meeting, we kind of presented those kind of summaries, and what we'll do is we'll do some kind of summary where you can see all the wells, maybe certain types of wells or something like that. But we could color code the location of each well to give you an idea of, like, during the drought, this well, it would be color coded to resemble about, just eyeballing here, looks about 40 to 50 feet lower during the droughts. But in normal years, there's not even really a difference
Okay,
according to the model.
so
So
we'll
we-
get those maps. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we could produce maps in the future.
Well, I have a comment, Chair Long.
Go ahead.
Looks like we have to get pretty high up in the, how much extra we're pumping before we get into any significant numbers. If you're looking at many hundreds of wells, and I would suspect, but I don't know, that still the only wells that are being affected until you get to the very highest pumping levels are very shallow wells.
Right.
So the vast majority of wells would survive it.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, to your point, yeah, these are the number of wells, either type we would expect. And there's like I can't remember off the top of my head how many, hundreds of wells in Fillmore and at least 100 wells in Piru. So if we did a percentage, this is a pretty, it's less than 10% or maybe even less than that.
Very significant if it's your well, but
Yeah, on that point, the municipal wells are, apparently they're constructed deep enough to not even worry about this situation. Domestic wells would be a obvious concern because they rely on their water. So this might be a very sensitive well type to consider. And obviously agricultural users want to be able to use their wells to irrigate.
well, unfortunately, probably, I would guess that many of those domestic wells are very shallow.
Yeah, to your point, exactly.
You're talking about many hundreds of feet deep for probably the municipal wells and most ag wells, but the domestic wells just might be 80 or 100 feet.
Right. Yeah, that's probably the main factor.
And also the output of those wells would be very low, very important for your house, but perhaps there are other ways that we can solve that problem that we've discussed in the past.
Right.
Just wanted to provide a summary table so that you could see that, it takes baseline plus a fairly significant percentage increase before we start seeing significant numbers of wells that have their water levels fall below the bottom of the screen. So, a 20 or 40% increase is not quite so bad, but by the time you start jumping up into the 80 to 100% increase, now we start to see noticeable increase in the number of wells. So it's just something to help calibrate your thinking when you're talking about how much we can pump and how long is the recovery time going to be in the basins. If we say we're going to pump it at baseline plus 20, well, what's the change in recovery time when we move from a drought condition back into a more wet condition? So we thought that was important information for you to take a look at tonight.
Okay.
It definitely would be nice to also see it spatially, to see, is it spread out across the basin or is it, in specific locations within the basin? So I'm eager to see that information too.
Right.
Yeah, I see a question there in the chat about the stress test utilized one well to predict what would happen in multiple wells. No, the stress test was used to predict what would happen in a variety of wells. It wasn't just using one well to summarize what happens to all. We looked at multiple with hundreds of wells in there, and that's where this summary table comes from.
Well, it seems like if you looked at your groundwater modeling, this type of thing would show up at the very edges of the borderline where there's more mountain, and then, go deeper in the middle is what I'm thinking, where the river goes through. Am I right on that, or?
Well, I don't know this, but I would suspect that many of the wells that might go dry might actually be out in the middle, and they might be 60 feet deep. So it may constructed for a very high water table at a very low cost.
Okay.
But if it dropped 50 feet, they would be in trouble.
Gotcha. Obviously, I don't talk about wells every day, but I'm trying. Okay. Is that all with the questions? Is there any other questions? I don't see any raised hands. I figure I might as well check
Mhm.
that quick. Okay, keep going, Tony. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's your
Or
turn, Tony.
Patrick. Tony.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll take over for the next phase. So Patrick, you drop off and I'll share. All right, you should see the screen now. So what we're going to do at this point in time is continue on with our discussion that we began in previous meetings about water levels and surface water, groundwater depletion due to pumping, that kind of thing, and get a little more into that and into the potential impacts associated with vegetation in the primary areas of GDEs in the basin. So let's jump into some things here. One graphic that we've seen before, I believe, is prepared by the folks at United. And so it's depicting here what the surface water flows are in the Santa Clara River along various reaches. And so if you come out here to the end, you are, just east of Fillmore out towards the fish hatchery area, and you're going all the way down to the Freeman diversion. And so what this very nicely shows, based on the actual numbers there, but also the size of the dots on each one of the maps, it's showing you how, as the drought progressed through time, the flow quantities went down. Some of the reaches of the streams became disconnected. They became intermittent, or at least difficult to determine where the shallowest water was. And so you get down to where you see at the late 2017 that we've got much smaller areas than we had earlier in this process. And so we're going to take a little bit more of a look at that and see if we can tease out some additional relationships between groundwater and surface water flows. And we're going to focus a lot of attention on the areas of rising groundwater. And we'll get a map up on the screen here in a moment to talk about that in general. So if you remember from a couple episodes back of this story, we had some information from United that they'd identified relationships between water levels in certain wells and stream flow. So here's measured stream flow, here's water levels in there. And so they found these relationships, which have amazingly high correlation coefficients. An 87% correlation coefficient is pretty darn strong in the Willard Road area. And in the fish hatchery area, we have one that's about a 95% correlation coefficient. So this is very, very promising. It doesn't mean that these relationships are causal, but they are at least empirical to help us get a handle on surface water flows at various times of the time series for this. So where are we going to talk about this? Well, we're talking about generally the two areas that we're going to label Willard Road and the fish hatchery area. And so just to get you oriented, here's the Willard Road, kind of in the western end of the Fillmore Basin. Here's the fish hatchery area that we're going to talk about. I'm assuming you guys can see my cursor moving around. Can you do that? Because I'm moving it around. Okay, good. You can see it. I'm not just talking to myself here and pointing at things that you can't see. I've had conversations with the folks at Stillwater, and it's their opinion that these two areas are the primary, most important areas of GDEs for these two basins to consider as we develop our GSP. And part of that importance criteria comes from the number of vegetative communities that there are, cottonwoods, willows, et cetera. There's some special status species that are likely to exist in the area, although we have to be careful that we have not done specific field surveys in these areas looking for all of these plants and or other species. So let's jump into these in just a little bit more detail. Well, maybe a lot more detail as I think about it. So we have here the fish hatchery area. So I just put a dash line just to focus your eyes on the general area that we're talking about, just to orient you a little bit. There's the fish hatchery right there. The boundary line between Fillmore and Piru is the red dash line there. And so as we were working our way through these data sets last time, we had that empirical relationship that you saw for the wells there, and we can use that empirical relationship and the groundwater elevations that United prepared from their modeling runs to estimate the amount of surface water depletion associated with groundwater pumping in the area. And so this graph depicts on the y-axis over here, your simulated rising groundwater in cubic feet per second. And we have two lines on the graph. The black line is baseline. That means current conditions, exactly what we're doing right now historically. And then the sort of gold or orange colored line there is where we turned off the pumping in the A and B aquifer layers in the model and looked to see what the difference was in the groundwater elevations. So when we have those differences in the elevations, we have our empirical relationship between elevation and flow. We can then create a graph that looks like this, that tells you what happens to the amount of rising groundwater at this location. So the interesting thing to look at is that obviously the yellow line, the no pumping scenario, is higher on the graph than the baseline conditions. So there is some impact of groundwater pumping on surface water flow. Well, how much is that impact? Well, in the normal or wet periods of time here in the middle part of the graph, you can visually look at this and you can see the difference between these points is maybe 5 CFS. If you poke around in here, you can find some that is probably closer to 10 CFS and that kind of thing. So that gives you an idea of what the general effect of it might be like. But the interesting thing that we wanted to focus mostly on is these periods here in the droughts. And so what this is telling us, that based on these simulations and the relationships that have been identified, that the baseline condition here indicates that in the late 1980s, early 1990 drought period, we had about 28 months where there was no flow, where the surface water, the rising groundwater had been depleted at that location. If there hadn't been pumping, you can see that there's maybe, let's just call that 5 CFS rounded off, still occurring in that area. And so there is some depletion of pumping, some depletion of rising groundwater associated with that time period. If we move out to the most recent drought here and look, we can see that that period of depleted rising groundwater is longer, something on the order of 58 months time frame. But even if there wasn't pumping, there's a distinct opportunity here that we're going to have, there's going to have periods where there was no rising water, even if there was no pumping there. So there's like added up 24 months worth of time in there where the no pumping scenario still indicated that there was going to be a depletion of the rising groundwater. So this is telling us a little bit of a story that it looks like there is impact from groundwater pumping on the amount of rising groundwater and actually the length of time of which those rising groundwater conditions actually occur. One of the things we have to note when we look at these kinds of graphs is that in both droughts, we get a recovery going. When wetter conditions prevail, then we get a recovery. The rising groundwater conditions come back relatively quickly just based on the steepness of this line. They come back quickly, So it's a relatively finite period of time. There's a sharp end to both the beginning and end of the period where we have depleted rising groundwater. So I think this is a pretty interesting graph, and it's telling us a pretty interesting story that will help us in the GSP. So if we're in a situation where we've depleted the rising groundwater, we have no rising groundwater, for example, in this earlier drought period, then what can we do to try to figure out what's the likely depth of the groundwater at that location during that time period? And so we took a look at a well, kind of right in the middle of the area right there.
Tony,
It's a domestic well in the B zone.
Can I-
Yes.
can I just interrupt? Can you go back to the other one? Just your talk. So this is surface water flow. This is water running above ground.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's the rising groundwater there that composes the surface water is what it is.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
As long as we're taking a break, there's a question in the chat box. As long as we,
Thank you, Lisa.
can you please just discuss how well calibrated the model is at the 2 wells used in the empirical relationships?
Oh, I did not present that graphic, and I probably should have. Those 2 wells are very well calibrated, and so that was one of the criteria that United used to select those wells and to identify what that empirical relationship was. They looked to use wells that were well calibrated. They're in the general vicinity of there, and it wouldn't do us any good to have an empirical relationship where the calibration was poor or suspect. So they took care of that early on and screened out those wells that did not have as good a correlation between measured and simulated groundwater elevations. So if we're going to go down a path and try to figure out what the groundwater elevations might be during the drought period, and obviously we don't have wells everywhere. So we found a well. It's kind of in the center of the area. It's right on the border between Fillmore and Piru. It's kind of in the center of the area we're looking at. And so we're looking at the time series of water levels. And so the blue dots, just like Patrick mentioned earlier, are measured water levels in that well. The black line is the baseline, the historical baseline conditions there. And the yellow line that we have on there is a baseline plus 20, just for reference purposes. And so what we're seeing here is that at this particular location of the basin, the model is under predicting the water levels. It's saying that the water level should be down here in the drought when the actual measurements are up here. It's saying the water levels are down here when the measurements say it's really more in this arrangement. So if we use this model as a way to develop our manual adjustment, if you will, from the model data, we could say, well, what is that difference? That difference is about 40 feet. If we come over to the most recent drought, that difference is about 38 feet. So rounded off, 40 feet is a pretty pretty good number that we need to manually adjust the water levels up to account for the bias that's in this particular area of the model. So here is a synthetic, a simulated, if you will, water level time series for a spot on the ground near the fish hatchery in layer 3, which is the layer immediately around the Santa Clara River there. And so we can see, as expected, it drops down in the late 1980s, early 90s drought, and again in the recent drought, and shows its recovery period. But we thought that the model was under predicting water levels in this area. So if we apply our correction coefficients to that thing, we can come back and adjust this level up, and then we get an idea that the groundwater elevation might be on the order of 27 feet below ground surface. If we did that similarly on the other side in the other drought, then we're coming up with about 32 feet. So the point being, rounded off 30 feet below ground surface is the estimate of where the groundwater levels were during the droughts. So is everybody following along with that? Okay, excellent. So these water level declines that we saw there are similar to what we saw in the 2011-2016 water level decline here in this part of the world. So there's 26 over here, there's 30 and 35 in there, and they get a little higher as you go towards the west. So if we've now decided that there's water level decline during the drought periods, what's the effect of the drought enhanced water level declines on vegetation in the areas of the rising groundwater. And so there are a variety of ways to do that. And so we took a look at the satellite derived data sets out there. These are on the Nature Conservancy's GDE Pulse tool. You can go online and look up this information, and they've got a nice interactive map series there that we're going to look a little bit at. There are a couple of primary metrics that are shown here based on the near infrared and shortwave infrared spectrum. And so these are all satellite derived measurements. And the NDVI, the Normalized Derived Vegetation Index, and here's the formula for it if you wish to do your own calculations of it, I suppose. But generally, what is it telling us? It's a measure of greenness of the vegetation. So a high NDVI value would mean greener than a low NDVI value. Similarly, there's another measurement index, the moisture index, is the NDMI. I'm not going to talk so much about that tonight. I'm going to stick with the NDVI just for the sake of brevity and getting us through the presentation. The results are pretty much similar. So we're going to focus on the NDVI. So here we are. Fish hatcheries right in here, just to orient yourself. And on the TNC Pulse Tool site, you can select a few preset time intervals. And so here's the long-term interval. This is a 33-year interval, so 85 to 2018. And you can see the colorings in here. And then they give you a color gradient here that tells you what does this beige color mean versus an orange color versus a green color. And so we see a lot of the colors out here in the area of this area of rising groundwater, and the GDE vegetation is showing little to no change, or maybe slightly moderate increase in the NDVI over this long period. Okay, and so I picked a spot on the ground right here where this yellow star is located. And I did that because you probably can't see it. It's very small when it comes off their site, but it's the dominant species there is red willow. And so I said, well, willow's a significant species. What does the NDVI look like over time? And so here's the graph of that. So we can see it decreases during the drought. Vegetation is more stressed, makes total sense. It recovers when it comes out of the drought, makes sense. It bops along here, pretty much constant. Here we come up to our 2011 time point, and we drop back down into another drought session again. And so we're seeing something where in a drought, we get stressed vegetation, it recovers, it stays in place, and then it gets stressed again. What's interesting is when we look at the precipitation curve here, we see these years when we had big bumps in rainfall. It's not particularly sensitive or recorded in the NDVI, nor in the moisture content here. So it's a pretty stable situation in this particular spot on the ground.
Tony, is
So
that because of the root
kind of
structure?
It could
Do
be
you know
because of the root
if it-
structure, yeah.
Because they stated that in the GDE workshop that we had done at the GRA conference, they were talking about root structures that are 30 feet deep. Those are the ones that we need to be considered. And
Well,
so what I'm seeing in this
I guess
graph
there's
is
a couple
that
of
consistency.
Yeah, and I picked the areas that were dominated by willows, and you'll see it in a moment, cottonwoods, because those were things that Stillwater particularly identified as being crucial species, plant species that we want to be thinking about when we're setting our minimum thresholds and that kind of thing. So, I mean, obviously there are plant species out there that have shallower root structures than maybe the trees do, and so we have to be sensitive to them as well. But it doesn't mean that this area is dominated by, or excuse me, it means it's dominant by red willow, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other species in there mixed in with it.
Thank you.
Okay, so what this is showing you is that on a longer scale, over a 30+ year scale, we're not seeing a whole lot of change in the NDVI or the greenness of the vegetation in that area. And so this is the kind of time scale that we're thinking about for the GSP. We're talking about basin scale, And we're talking about, you know, a 20-year compliance year, 50, 70 years, we're looking out into the future. So this is the kind of timescale that we're looking on. Now, we can drill down into this data set a little bit more. And so what do we look like if we just go from 2009 to 2018? And so that's this little colored area shaded out here on the graph that you can see. And so you can see that the drought period dominates this area a lot more. And so you see these colors turning to red. So there's a large decrease in the NDVI. So vegetation are stressed during the drought. Totally expected. Exactly what we thought would kind of happen. Moisture content, you know, does a similar thing as the NDVI does there. So it's, as you scroll through this and we go a little bit finer and we look at 2014 through 2018. And so we're sort of at the downward slide on the drought and we're starting to come back out of it. So we've got kind of a equal mix of time that's in the drought heavy and also in the recovery period. We see that those red patterns are going away. We're seeing some oranges, we're seeing a few blues and greens pop back up out there. And so we're seeing a recovery phase, at least with respect to the NDVI is telling us. So presumably during this period, we're starting to get some shallower water coming back into play. And so we're just seeing a situation where the vegetation is exhibiting a certain degree of resilience to the water stress that it's being subjected to by the drought. So it's interesting to think about how resilient is the vegetation in these areas. And so I thought I would take a little bit different angle and look at this from another perspective. And so let's take a quick tour through some historical area photography starting in 2001. And so just to orient you quickly, there's the fish hatchery again. Okay, and so we're talking about this general area out here. And so I want you to take a look at the vegetation patterns here. This is this dark area of the GDEs that we're talking about. The lighter areas out here, those are the unvegetated, more sandy wash areas. And so let's take a little tour through time here. So we're in 2002. We're in 2004. Looks kind of the same, about, you know, pretty similar. 2005 comes and we have flooding. Okay, again, there's the fish hatchery to orient you. That's obviously nice muddy Santa Clara River that United wants to get to the Freeman diversion as quickly as possible so they can divert and replenish the Oxnard Plain. So we're seeing some heavy flooding going on there. And then here we are at the end of 2005, and we see lots of sandy area. Vegetation has been scoured away and it's gone. It's washed on downstream a certain distance. And so what's important, as I was told by the folks at Stillwater, is that, yes, this is going to happen. And whatever the recurrence interval is on that 2005 flood event, if it's a 50-year event or a 25-year event, meaning that the recurrence interval is on average, once every 25 years or 50 years or whatever that number is, it doesn't matter exactly what it is that there's a chance that the vegetation gets, at least a portion of it, gets scoured away. But when we have these little patches, these remnants that remain here, those become the seed areas for replenishment of the vegetation there. And so as we move forward in time, so here we are right at the end of 2005. When we go to 2007, we're seeing things start to reestablish themselves in here. And when we get to 2011, we see that we're looking back pretty much where we were pre that flooding event. And so I've sort of superimposed the two here next to each other. And so you can see they look very similar to each other. Not identical, of course, but pretty similar to each other. So some kind of observations that we're making here when we're talking about this is that, yeah, there can be significant recovery from scour events. So when we're thinking that these These patches of vegetation get stressed during droughts. That's true, no doubt about that. But they're resilient. They can recover. The patches can even recover when they're totally scoured away and they're gone. And those areas come back with time and with appropriate hydrologic conditions. So we get that shallow groundwater coming back to them. So drought periods stress the vegetation as we're recording with the NDVI indices. Again, it recovers. The modeling data suggests that the rising groundwater is partially depleted due to groundwater extractions in this area. And it looks like that groundwater elevation may be on the order of 30 feet below ground surface when we're in that high stress drought type scenario. So that's kind of running our way through it and looking at this from a couple of different directions to try to figure out what's the impact of pumping on surface water flows. And we've gone through that argument and discussion, and then going into the effect on vegetation based on the satellite data. So this is for the fish hatchery, and we'll go through a similar routine for the Willard Road. It's a little bit different, but similar, and we can bop through that because you've already heard the explanation of the rationale that we're doing. So do we want to go through questions on this particular area, or you want to wait till we get to the end? It doesn't matter to me either way it works.
Let's ask if there's any other questions before we move on.
I've got questions, but I'll wait.
Okay. All right, then go ahead, Tony.
Okay. Moving on. So we're going to talk about the Willard Road area. And so where are we? This is the edge of Santa Paula over here. This red line is the boundary between Santa Paula Basin and the Fillmore Basin. Willard Road is right here. And so we're calling this the Willard Road area. And so you can see the vegetation in there. You get the idea of what we're talking about. The yellow dotted line doesn't mean it's necessarily the boundary of it. It's just drawing your eye to this particular reach of the Santa Clara River. So in this situation, we used the empirical relationship also and came up with a curve that looks a little different. It's similar to what we saw at the fish hatchery in that obviously it's showing some depletion of groundwater, of rising water rather, due to pumping. Again, the no pumping curve is higher. There's more flow. For example, here we're around 15 CFS, and we're down here around 5 CFS under baseline conditions in the last drought. Over here, we're down still around 5 CFS and maybe got as low as 10 CFS in that most recent drought under a no pumping scenario. And so we're seeing a period where this really isn't an area where we're totally dewatering the surface water. It's not totally going away in this particular location. Now you also saw that was consistent with what we saw from the what was it, 6 little snippets of maps that were put together by United showing how the wetted reaches decreased in length and became intermittent. And so this is at the end down by Willard Road where we had more of a likelihood of having intermittent or of constant flow. So we don't need to go through the idea of where is the depth of groundwater beneath this because we already have rising groundwater at the surface. So we don't need to go through that process. But we do need to talk a little bit about what's going on with the health of the vegetation there based on the satellite data. And so I picked this spot on the ground. There's Willard Road again, just to orient you. Spot there where the yellow star is black cottonwood. It's dominated by black cottonwood, and a lot of this area here and here is a cottonwood and some willow mixed in there. So I would call your attention to the NDVI record here for 1985 going all the way out to 2018, and look at the curve. It's much, much different than what we saw over at the fish hatchery. Mm-hmm. Okay. General trend says the NDVI is going up over this 33-year-ish period, and we see a little drop right at the end for the most recent drought, the drought period. And I could pop around here and pick other spots on the pulse tool and get a pretty similar looking graph. I'll find a few of them where the The drought area out here isn't quite as steeply dipping, and there's one or two spots I found that were a little more steeply dipping, but this is a very common looking kind of graph in that area. And so we're seeing the similar story that we saw before, is that on a long-term scale, the 30+ year kind of scale, we're not seeing a whole lot of change in quote, the health or the greenness of the vegetation there at that point on the ground. If we narrow it down to the 2009 to 2018 time period, so you can see that sort of shaded block over here is now the time period that we're dealing with. You can see we're popping in there with some blues, a little more greens, which are telling us there's a large increase or a moderate increase in the NDVI, but we're also starting to see a few little patches of red and orange peek through in certain places. So it's not all the same. These areas right along the channel seem to have nice blues and greens associated with them. If they're a little bit off channel, maybe they're not getting quite as much flow in that sense. But again, a little to no change, or maybe some moderate increases in the greenness. If we drop into the drought period more intently in the 2014 and then coming out of it through 2018, we see that we get more red occurring here in these areas. And so that's this little tail end of the NDVI curve here that we're looking at. And so the amount of this decline varies from spot to spot on the ground, but this is a pretty typical example for what we're seeing there. So I think if we had selected some other areas, then these general trends are going to be the same, but the responses here are pretty much generally better with higher NDVIs. So let's jump into our little historical photo tour here. So here's 2002, Willard Road coming down here. Okay. And so you get an idea of the distribution of the vegetation. You saw those areas where the star was in here, in this particular area. And so let's just walk through a few of them. So there's 2002. About a year later in 2003, looks similar. Okay. 2005, we have a drought, or excuse me, a flooding event that happens. We get some scour going on. At the end of 2005, this is what we see. We've lost some of our vegetation. We've lost some of it here. It's become scoured away, but we still do have those remnant areas here, where we have potential sources of seeds that can help repopulate the area and bring back the vegetation. And if we look, whoops, excuse me, heavy finger on the button there. So here we jump to 2007, a couple of years later, and we're seeing that things are returning. We're getting more green in that area. 2011, and again, this is 2011. Remember, that's about when we began to notice the serious effects of the drought. It was starting in 2011, so I cut off the video or the air photo tour here in 2011, just to give you an idea of how the vegetation can recover. And so if we sort of put a before and after the flooding event comparison maps up here, we can see that these look similar to each other. Are they identical? Well, of course not. They're not going to be identical, but we're seeing the recovery of these areas with the cottonwoods and willows in this nice kind of forested area. So similar conclusions, you know, there can be significant recovery from the scour. The drought periods do stress the vegetation. We saw that. The vegetation seems to recover in this part of the world. It generally doesn't have an issue with depleted groundwater during the droughts. And again, we're talking about down at the Willard Road area here, sort of at the end of the groundwater basin there before it transitions into the Santa Paula area. And that rising groundwater persists throughout the major drought events recorded in our historical data set. So that's the essence of what I wanted to bring forward for the board to discuss and to get input from the board and see what your impressions are for where we're moving, how we move forward. I'm interested to hear what Mr. Keeler has to say with his satellite data interpretation as well. So questions?
Tony, I've got a couple of questions. If you go back to the slide that shows NDVI trend 1985-2018 for the fish hatchery area, and actually all the NDVI data ends at 2018. It'd be very interesting to see what happens in 2019 when we had quite a bit more water coming down the river.
Right.
Since I live next to it, I would suspect that you'd see quite a dramatic change upward in the NDVI factors. So that would be very interesting to see if the data is available. And then
I think that data are available.
It's also interesting to see the effect of the flooding 2005. I saw that very directly from my house in 2005, but it appears from the photographs that you showed us that there was pretty decent recovery. I'll say maybe partially recovery from that flooding based on what you showed us in, say, 5 to 6 years after the flood. Whereas it's interesting to see that the NDVI factors seem to show recovery after a drought period within a year or so. So just very interesting things I really hadn't thought of before that come out in your presentation.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go at the recovery concept from a couple of different directions. We can say the vegetation is stressed from the drought, and then how does it recover? But then also if we get catastrophic and we actually scour out the vegetation, well, can it recover from that? And it's obvious that it has been doing that in the Santa Clara River. So that's just two perspectives on recovery there that I wanted to bring forward.
And
I think, Tony, the one thing that I did have a follow-up with Christopher about was, in NDVIs with regards to the vegetation index, and these scour events also provide opportunities for Arundo Donax to come in and establish itself. And his study doesn't really differentiate between native vegetation and Arundo and non-native species like tamarisk. But apparently there is some research underway that's going to hopefully address that too, because I mean, obviously having Arundo established is something we don't want to have happen because it evapotranspirates at such a high degree. And it also becomes like monolithic and takes over. And that's not good for water use and water consumption. So that's just a concern with using this, but that concern was raised with Stillwater as well.
Sure.
The other thing is that some of these vegetation maps were done in 2005, and as you show from the flooding events, like vegetation did change significantly. And I'm just wondering, because Stillwater did do some analysis when I was with CalTrout, we did some updates of vegetation mapping for the IRWM grant for Arundo removal in the Santa Paula, like Willard Road sort of area. And I'm just wondering if there is more up-to-date data available with regards to vegetation mapping, because even like you have flood events, you also have fire events, and fire events can also change the vegetation quite significantly. And again, provides an opportunity for Arundo Donax to come in. And just, those are definitely some issues that Stillwater is going to have to consider, because this vegetation mapping is a bit outdated.
That's a good point about the
Right,
Arundel. Candace, we certainly saw a huge spread of that in the areas that we observed. And I can tell you, we was pulling Arundel rhizomes out of the top of lemon trees in some of the really heavily flooded areas, and it just went everywhere.
Wow.
Tamarix too. All it takes to start a tamarix is lay a stick sideways in muddy ground, and it roots in and shoots up sprouts.
Yeah.
A nasty invasive weed.
Other questions, comments?
Lisa, there's some other comments also.
I don't want to jump ahead because Christopher's going to present in January. But I think there's definitely a differentiation between, when you hone in onto those drought specific intervals, when we see the large decreases in the red zones. I think the concern is whether or not the plant can actually survive the stress, and with regards to survivability with long ongoing stress. Some species are better at bouncing back and others just don't. Like once the water level drops a certain amount for a certain amount of time, they just don't recover as well. And that said, like, and these are the type of things we're discussing as the environmental stakeholder group. We're not, it's not for the whole basin. It's for very location specific issues, and how to address those very location specific issues, because the groundwater levels are actually, what Christopher's research is showing, are actually a lot more sensitive at a much lower level. We're talking less than 10 feet differences have catastrophic impacts on GDEs. So it is going to probably require some very active management in specific locations. But it is encouraging to see the longer term data that, the NDVI levels remain pretty constant too. But there are definitely going to be challenges around those very drought specific time periods.
Candace,
And I think that's where this is one area where the board's going to have the tough decision to make the call on what's significant and unreasonable.
Candace, can you define what you mean by catastrophic effects on the GDEs?
Well, where whole stands of cottonwoods die, like whole stands, not just a few individual plants showing stress, but like the stands, these swaths of vegetations that you see on the maps actually die because of lack of connectivity to groundwater.
I think the primary area where most of the black cottonwoods are is the Willard Road area. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that was encouraging to see that the rising water persisted throughout major droughts. That was encouraging to see.
It's also interesting to see on some of the final Willard Road slides that Tony showed that there were still areas that were showing bright blue, which seemed to indicate a continued recovery from some of the scouring events earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have a hand raised. Brian Bondi, I think, has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Tony. I noticed this presentation is very different than what was emailed out. I guess it's been posted on the website. It'd just be helpful to know when presentations change, because I did take, some of us did take the time to review what was posted before, and only to be surprised that it had much more information. So thanks for the information. One comment I want to make is that I think we, in this conversation, continue to combine two sustainability indicators, or conflate two sustainability indicators. And at some point, we're going to have to parse out the depletion of interconnected surface water versus effects related to groundwater levels. Now, those are obviously intimately related in these areas, but Sigma will require us to parse those out and actually define what the significant unreasonable effects of surface water being depleted versus effects of groundwater levels on the GDEs. And so I just encourage us to try and start parsing that out in our conversations, because we're going to have to analyze it and determine separate criteria for those two related but separate things in Sigma. I guess this is all, really good information. What I'd like to understand is, and maybe this is more of a question for the biologists on the team, but when we have areas of things that die either because they're scoured away or because they don't make it through the drought, I think, Tony, your slides pretty much showed that they come back. So I'm wondering, is that a significant and unreasonable effect? If things come back over some time scale, what is the effect other than, is there a biological effect? Is there a loss of critical habitat that's critical to a particular endangered species during that period of time? Or is the main impact that the river looks a little less green, the river area looks a little less green, it's a little less appealing to folks? And I'm trying to draw that contrast, not to be offensive to anybody, but to try and make the point that we have to understand what the actual effects are in order, and what's affected and how significant that is in order to get to deciding how we're going to manage these issues. And so I hope there's more coming in that realm of that topic, because it's not clear to me if what we see is significant or unreasonable based on what we're presenting. And so hopefully Stillwater can put some finer points on that and help us understand, what are the effects when these things happen. I hope I'm making sense. Thank you.
Yeah, you are, Brian. And I didn't want to get into it because I'm not really the right person for it. It's Stillwater should be making this presentation. When we delve into, well, gee, what is the effect? To the question of, if there's a die-off in a stand of cottonwoods, well, what replaces it? Is that a significant, when we have a different vegetation type come in? Yes, no, I'm not the one to answer that. I think that's more in the realm of Stillwater's area of expertise. But I do agree with you, Brian, that that's something that has to be wrestled with and talked about. And that's why I made the comment that this is a difficult thing for the board to wrestle with, to decide, well, if there is stress on the vegetation, how much stress is too much, so that it kicks over into that significant and unreasonable category. If we say long-term, the vegetation looks like it comes back, gets stressed for some period, but it comes back. Well, what happens during the periods when it's stressed? Is the vegetation mix changing? Is it changing for the better? Is it changing for the worse? That kind of thing. And so that's the kind of detail we'll tease out from the Stillwater data.
Yeah, and the same question.
Appreciate your comments, Brian.
Yeah, and the same question for the surface water in the Fillmore Piru area. If that goes to zero, are there aquatic species that are living in the surface water itself that are significant and reasonably impacted? And hopefully we can learn more about that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Tony,
Agreed.
One more comment from me. There were some other factors affecting certain riparian species during some of the periods that you've outlined. There are areas where Polypicus shot-hole borer which loves both the black cottonwood and willow, there have been some problems with some of the native riparian species. Do you know if any other effects, such as the Polypicus shothole borer or other shothole borers, were taken into consideration here?
I don't know how they would have been taken into consideration here, Ed, because this is strictly satellite derived data, and I don't think they're going to be able to tease those two apart.
I know in areas that have been affected in the past decade by Polypicus shothole borer, there's been, if you looked behind Prado Dam, as the species spread through the native vegetation there, or Santa Ana River, or other down in San Diego County, San Luis Rey, there were huge effects on the native vegetation just from that insect pest. So something we should keep in mind too. And I don't know the answer to how it affected these two particular areas, but I know barrancas and creeks in different parts of the county that were heavily impacted.
Yeah, there's definitely locations on the main stem and, you know, in that Bullard Road vicinity, maybe a little bit north. And I suppose that it also comes to that point of if groundwater pumping is impacting the resilience of the plant, then they're also more susceptible to the shothole borer. But whether or not that's a significant impact, you know, is to be discussed. But
as I said, I know.
I think when you start, when different environmental factors start being cumulative on one another, it's very difficult to tease out where groundwater levels and surface flow, the criteria that they are using is probably the best right now. It gets a little bit tricky when you layer on different factors.
That's true, although I just have to be careful because from what I've seen from heavily damaged riparian habitats due to shothole borer, different species of shothole borer, the NDVI factor would be heavily impacted, would be changed. I don't know the answer to our local GDUs though.
Tony, Brian Bondi has his hand up.
Brian, did you get all your questions answered? Or do you have any more?
Yes, I just failed to lower my hand. I apologize.
No, that's what I was thinking. Okay, I did have a question. In the resources that DWR provides us, they're also based on our classification of our basin. They did also classify certain species that they're concerned with. Is that correct? And are we following suit with either the plants or fish or anything else?
Well, they leave that, I don't know that they actually gave us a list of species that they were particularly interested in, but I do think they are generally interested in anything that has a special status. If it's threatened, endangered, that kind of thing. If they fall into that category, then definitely DWR is interested in hearing about them.
Okay, because I remember they had the classification on their website. They had all this modeling and then information in regards to either the species or the brown willow or whatever it was. And then it showed in our basin and where it was, like the white oak and so forth. So that'll be something we'll need to make sure we collect.
Yeah, very good.
And the reason why I bring that up is in case, like Brian had stated about, well, if it's this tree, you know, that we're looking at, what species of fish or amphibian or whatever is affected was listed on that as well. Thank you. All right, any other questions? This is I have to say, I like the graph showing, even with the inconsistency of the water and so forth, that it is really a good thing to see that it's consistent. Brian did have a question. It says, have the GDEs that were in the hills been screened out?
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
Stillwater's opinion is that we're focusing on the large patches and those with the most important suite or assemblages of vegetation and likely critters associated with that. And so their opinion is it's these two areas of rising groundwater that are the dominant areas that we should be concerned with for the development of the GSPs.
Okay, good. That's good to know. I like that question. Any other questions? Hearing none, go ahead, Tony. Is there anything else?
Not from me. I think we're good. Good discussion. Thank you.
Okay, with that, anyone else have any further questions on our this item before it's a receive and file? And all the information that we're getting is really important for continuing with it. I just want to give everyone one more opportunity to ask any questions.
So Tony, what will be our next steps on this? What do you anticipate?
I think what we're going to have to take into consideration some of the stuff that Brian was talking about. And we've already been internally tossing that around about how are we going to parse out the surface water, groundwater interaction type variables and see how we want to handle that, understanding that we have these two analyses done at 2 points in the basin. We don't have it everywhere in the basin. So we're going to take a look at that and see what we can tease out of that and out of the model data as well. So I think that's probably the next step. I really want to hear Mr. Keebler's information and get with Stillwater and review that and see how that can be woven into our analyses here, and then come back to the board with revised sustainable management criteria for these suggested criteria, and then they'll straw them in for everybody to talk about and to comment on and help us revise those.
All right.
I think at the end of January we should have some of the future looking forecast information. The modeling runs out of United, and so we'll be able to take a look at those and see what the groundwater levels are looking like in the future out there, and then that will help inform more of the discussion when we were talking about groundwater elevations, the presence or absence of chronic decline, groundwater storage, etc.
Fascinating stuff, Tony, and what a great tool Google Earth is for that kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
Agreed.
Better yet, it's free.
That stuff used to cost a lot of money.
Well, there are several of us that have spent time scouring manual air photos and purchasing them online when they first became digital. And so it's great when Google comes out and says, we'll just give them to you. Take them and use them.
Free public information, very advantageous for us.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have the next steps. Are there any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right. So we will be receiving and filing this information. I need a motion for it.
So moved.
Okay, I'm going to take Director McFadden for a first and Director Kimball for a second, figuring that was an easy one. And roll call, please.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Minigan,
Aye.
Director Pace.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Motion is approved unanimously. So we've heard from Tony that what our future topics for board discussion will be on sustainable management criteria. We have asked that our council and Tony Emmerich bring back a policy on late fees. So perhaps we give you the executive order to do this up to a limit is what I'd like to suggest. And then I've also heard that we're going to hear about the GDEs for the next board meeting with that presentation. And we are going to talk about the next stakeholder workshop. And what else?
Does that cover Candace's request?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Chair Long, tentatively by the material preparation time for or submission time for the January meeting, the pumpers will have been able to review the technical memo on subsidence and potentially offer an alternative straw man.
Okay. Anything else? All right, so we have Tony writing quickly.
Mhm.
Did you get all that, everyone?
Got
Okay,
it.
I think so.
great. Okay, well then, I just want to wish you all a very happy holidays and be safe, keep warm, and we'll be meeting back on January 21st.
Yeah. Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy
Okay,
holidays.
Happy holidays. Merry Christmas to all.
Thank
That
you.
concludes our
Bye.
meeting.
Happy
Thank
holidays.
you.
Get us some vaccinations, Kelly.
We got a lot more coming.
Guess we got to push the button too, Glenn.
I'm trying. I'm trying.
I'm working on it too.
See you tomorrow.